I know everyone's time is valuable, and it's just wonderful to have Catherine here to give us a webinar. So I'd like to warmly welcome all of you from the museum community to the first webinar that I hope will be the first of many. So when Catherine offered to give this presentation, she really needs no introduction. She's not only a very eminent scientist, board member of our museum, but she also talks on very interesting topics, and she does it very well. And when she offered to present, she gave me a list of choices, and the one that I chose was Science in a Fact-Free World, because I'm sure, like all of you, every day we're confronted with what happens when decisions are made not based on fact, or difficulties arising because of misunderstandings of the fact. And I think that's almost a daily occurrence for us. In fact, I was listening to an interview with the governor of Michigan earlier this morning, and she obviously has put in a lot of restrictions for her state, but people are very upset about that because they feel like it might be safe. And a feeling of it being safe is not really an evidence-based approach for what might be in the best interest of the group, or of anyone actually. So that for me was a really, like, every day we have a reminder of why facts are really important, but also as scientists, why the ability to communicate those facts is really critical and almost just as important as the work that generates those facts. Just a little bit of background about Catherine. I'm sure that she really needs no introduction, but in addition to being one of our quite new board members, she received her Bachelor's of Science in Physics and Astronomy from the University of Toronto. She then moved to the University of Illinois, where she moved into atmospheric science, where she did her master's and then subsequently her PhD. And that's where she really got into generating high resolution climate projections. And the work that she did as part of her PhD still feeds into work that she contributes to the world's longest title, the World Meteorological Organization's Coordinated Regional Downscaling Experiment for Empirical Statistical Downscaling. And this really resonated with me because since joining the museum, I have been astounded by the acronyms. I thought that I was, used to having acronyms, but that is the world's best acronym, WOMO Cordex ESD. Catherine has over 125 peer-reviewed publications, and she's also contributed to many reports in her field of expertise, particularly, of course, relating to climate change, but the US Global Change Research Program's Second National Climate Assessment, the US National Academy of Sciences report into climate stabilisation targets, and also in 2014, the third National Climate Assessment. She is a political science endowed professor in public policy and public law in the Department of Political Science, and a director of the Climate Centre and associate in the public health program of the Graduate School of Biomedical Sciences at Texas Tech University. She's also a principal investigator for the Department of Interior's South Central Climate Adaptation Science Centre. So, and of course, in addition to her many other commitments, she's a very valued member of our board. She is an incredible science communicator, as well as being a very established scientist herself. She has well over 100,000 followers on Twitter, if that's a measure that you might go by. And I love her Twitter description of herself, which is not suspicious, just Canadian, climate scientist, director, pol sci, professor, knitter, pastor's wife, mum, UN champion of the earth, Cape not included. I think that's a wonderful description of Catherine, and I know that we have a lot of people tuning in to listen to her today. I might also add just a housekeeping note. Catherine is clearly very adept at delivering content online. It's very true to her values of having a low carbon footprint, and she also has this very snazzy question generating approach that she's going to trial today, where she actually puts her questions in the slides and you can vote on them. So there will be time for questions at the end as well. But now it is my great pleasure to hand over to Catherine to give us her presentation on science in a fact-free world. Thank you, Catherine.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. It is such a pleasure to be with you here today. It looks like we have 133 people on so far. And Rebecca, I'm going to ask you to keep an eye on the waiting room, because we put a waiting room in for security purposes. So if you don't mind keeping an eye on that and letting people in, we still have a few people coming in as we go. But we're going to go ahead and get started. And this is recorded. So don't worry if it goes too fast and you feel like you missed something. It is going to be recorded. You will have the recording. And we are going to be taking questions at the end, but not in the chat window of Zoom. We're going to be doing it on the slides, and I'll show you how we're doing that in just a minute. All right, let me share my screen and we can get started. Here we go. So, how are we going to talk to each other? Like this. On your laptop or your computer, which most of you are on, or your iPad or whatever, I want you to go to pollev, pollev.com. You're going to have to enter Texas Tech, all one word. That's my university, no capital letters. It might ask you for your name, but you can just skip that. It's anonymous is fine. And when you go to pollev.com, it's going to ask you the first question. And here's the first question. It's an easy one. You just have to pick A, B, or C. And does it feel to you today, after we've been in lockdown now for, a month and a half, do you feel like it really is April 29, or is it April 324, or are you not quite sure what year it is? All right, we've got, oh, okay. So it's looking pretty evenly split. Nope, the April 29s are losing. I have to say, it does not feel like April 29. I feel like we've been in Groundhog Day for at least a couple of months at this point. So I think the bees are starting to win, but there is a significant part of the population who is not even sure what year it is anymore. And I'm with you on that one. Not quite sure if it's 2019 or 2021, or we've already gotten to 2025. All right. This is just to make sure that you had your morning coffee. Now, I want to ask you a question now, and now you're going to have to answer with a word. Ready? And this question is, just a second here. If you can describe what you do in one word, or if you really need two words, you can do that, but you have to connect two words with a dot. So for example, if you were going to say science teacher, you'd have to say science.teacher, but science is totally fine. So what do you do in one word, or at the most two? And this is a Wordle, and so what happens is the more people who say a certain word, the bigger it is. So obviously a number of you have said educate, but we've also got, oh, I like illustrate. That's awesome. We've got research, researcher, science. But then we've also got curation, facilitate, cataloging, retired. That's lovely. But you're still doing stuff as retired. Obviously, you're here today. Paleontology, stewardship. I like that. Volcanology, collections, fundraising, librarian, design. Excellent. I love this. You're also doing Zoom. Yes, we are all doing Zoom. Yeah, and these days it feels like that's all we're doing. I saw a picture yesterday of a skeleton head first on a desk, and the caption was "Death by Zoom." Ooh, bioarchaeology, that is fascinating. Genomics, outreach, statistics. Ooh, I like that one. Personify science. Yes, that's a lot of what we do, is personifying science. That is very cool. Okay, don't worry. I will share these graphics with you if you're interested, because I really enjoy seeing them myself too. But now you know how to use the polling software. So if you have a question, save your question till the end, but we're going to be entering the question the same way that you just did here. So now you know how to use it. All right, but now let's go ahead and start talking about how do we talk about science in this world that we live in. Misinformation is rampant, and it isn't only rampant about climate change, it's rampant even about the coronavirus pandemic. So for example, I looked and I said, here's a running list of the latest hoaxes spreading about the coronavirus. And this article that was written a couple of weeks ago, I thought was very interesting, because it said, fake news, how big is the threat? And it said this, it said the main issue is not that people gullibly accept whatever they're told. They fail to accept recommendations. Again and again, helpful warnings have gone unheeded and advice has been ignored. People believe the information is mistaken or even manipulative. Some mistrust towards politicians is unfortunate but understandable. But this widespread pattern of mistrust is not only something that we see today, it is something that we've seen throughout history. In fact, mistrust of expert opinion and official warnings was part of what led to the devastation after Hurricane Katrina, when people just ignored the evacuation warnings. And what we see here is we see something that social scientists call elite cues. In other words, when people who we agree with, who might not be experts, but they're people whose opinions we respect, are thought leaders, when they say something to us, which could be anything from oh no, we don't have to evacuate, to oh, maybe you should drink some bleach. When people say something to us and we trust those people, we tend to trust elite cues over expert opinion. And I found this very interesting because when you look at the social science of opinion on climate change, you see very much the same thing. This is a study that came out 4 years ago. And what Jason here found was that the number one factor explaining what people think about climate change is what thought leaders who they trust say about it. Not expert opinion, but thought leaders they trust. This was very depressing. This was their second conclusion. They said, promulgation of scientific information on climate change has no effect. Information-based science advocacy has only a minor effect. You might be saying, let's just wrap this up. This is so depressing. What else is there to say? No, don't worry. We've got a lot more to say that is more hopeful, but I want to start off by acknowledging how bad the problem is that we face. Political mobilization by elites and advocacy groups is critical in influencing climate change concern, and unfortunately, people only listen to elite opinions or advocacy groups that share their values that they already agree with. A more recent study from just this past year found specifically that political elites are associated with what people think about climate change. So in other words, results suggest that we should see climate change skepticism through a lens of people are following what others say who share their political opinions. So here's the thing, when we see people saying things like, for everyone who thinks it's warming, I can find somebody who says it isn't, or alarmist theories on climate science originate with scientists who operate outside the scientific method, we think to ourselves, if they just knew the facts, surely they'd change their minds, right? Because we have the facts. When it comes to climate change, if you just go to Google Scholar and you enter the words climate change, you get 2.6 million results. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has been publishing scientific reports since 1990. Today, I'm just finishing off an obituary for Sir John Houghton. He was the climate scientist who led the IPCC as the chair or the co-chair for the first 3 assessments. He just passed away 10 days ago as a result of COVID-19. He dedicated his life to making sure the facts were communicated accurately and consistently. We also know that we've got a national climate assessment. The first one was published in 2000, then there was number 2, then there was number 3. The last one, number 4, that was released 2 years ago, it was so big that we separated it out into 2 volumes. Volume 1 on the science was 500 pages, and volume 2 on the impacts was 1,600 pages. So yes, we absolutely have the science. And the science has been communicated by many experts. You're starting to see the problem here, right? It's been communicated by many experts. World scientists warn of an emergency. 11,000 scientists signed this letter from last year. It's been communicated over many centuries. The science explaining how digging up coal and oil and natural gas and burning it is releasing heat-trapping gases that are wrapping an extra blanket around the planet, causing us to run a fever. We've known that science since the 1800s. And the role of Eunice Foote there in the middle is actually a fascinating one. She was the first person to actually write in print in a paper submitted to the annual meeting of the American Association for the Advancement of Science in 1856, that if carbon dioxide levels were higher, the planet would be warmer. Just this past week, the New York Times ran this wonderful obituary of Eunice Foote. because they're running obituaries of people who are overlooked by history. So if you want to know more about Eunice, please go ahead and check out this obituary of her in the New York Times. And the fascinating thing is that her 1856 paper submitted to the AAAS, she did not read it in person. She did read her next paper the next year in person, but she did not read her 1856 paper in person. It was read by the president of the Smithsonian at that time. We communicate in many ways too. So this is a list that I maintain on Twitter. I collect names of scientists who do climate who are on Twitter. I checked this morning, I updated the numbers. We currently have 3,024 scientists on our list, and we have 9,600 subscribers, which I think is far too few. I think we should have many more subscribers than that to our list, but I'm working on it. So we think if everybody just knew all of this, surely they change their minds, right? No, not really. Why not? Well, to see why not, we have to take a detour. And you might think, well, what does this have to do with the science of climate change? Don't worry, you will connect the dots very quickly. Back in 1994, 26 years ago, this is what the landscape of the United States looked like politically. The median Democrat and the median Republican were closer to each other than they were to the tails of their own party. It was very much a centrist landscape. Over time, what has happened? Over time, we have seen 2011, 2017, and then only people who voted in the last election. Yes, the two parties have moved so far apart now that the median Republican and the median Democrat are closer to the tail of their own party than they are to each other. Our distributions are completely skewed, and the largest number of people are at the edges rather than in the middle. What does this have to do with climate change? Pretty much everything. Why? Because as of this year, the most politically polarized issues in the entire United States are climate change and environmental protection. So what you're looking at here is the length of the gray bar shows how far apart Republicans and Democrats are on a given issue. And the wider the bar, the more politically polarized the issue. In fact, it's gotten to the point with climate change that the number one predictor of whether we agree with the simple facts that climate is changing, humans are responsible, the impacts are serious, and we need to act, is not how much we know about science or how smart we are. It is simply where we fall on the political spectrum. Here is more on that. But first, I want to point out something important. It is not only happening in the United States. It is a symptom of the political polarization and tribalization that is spreading around the world. We had an election in Canada this fall, and the Conservative Party's climate plan was to literally increase carbon emissions. That was their plan. In the UK, Conservative members of Parliament are 5 times more likely to vote against climate action than Labour members. In Brazil, we all know what was happening there with the deforestation and the fires, and they're rolling back all kinds of legislation as well. In Australia, they had a carbon tax. They killed it. The Prime Minister right now was Prime Minister during the incredible bushfires they had. And he is basically saying, oh, climate isn't changing, humans aren't responsible. So this is not just a US issue. And I see this on Twitter. So here's the really interesting thing. I get stuff like this pretty much every day. If you follow me, you know, and most of it comes on Twitter, some on Facebook, even the occasional one on Instagram. It's not that frequent on Instagram, but I did get one today. And these are the types of things that I get. And this is not, you know, my greatest hits from the last year. This is just the first 3 things I picked out of my Dropbox of about 10,000 items when I went to pick some examples. So what do these people mention here? They mention sciencey sounding myths about plant food and propaganda and real science. But then when you look at these people's bios, which I always do because I'm curious before I block them, what do their bios say? The consistent thread here is politics. If they're in the US, they've got MAGA in their profile. If they're in Canada, they hate the Prime Minister. If they're in Australia, they love the Prime Minister. If they're in the UK, they support Brexit. Almost to a person, there is a nearly 100% correlation, not quite 100%, but nearly, between political perspectives and climate denial. So here's what we have to recognize. People do not really have a problem with three of the things we think they have a problem with. They don't really have a problem with the science that explains why climate is changing. And Dan Kahan is a social scientist from Yale who showed this. He said in a paper he published in Nature in 2012 with colleagues, he said, public apathy is often attributed to a lack of comprehension. People just don't know enough science, right? And if they don't know enough science, what's the solution? Well, the solution is clearly more science, right? We conducted a study to test for this, and we found no support. In fact, people with the highest degree of science literacy were not most concerned. They were most polarized. And then Dan went on to show how it's not lack of education or intelligence. Often people say, oh, those people are so stupid if they reject the science. But Dan went on to develop something they called a measure of ordinary science intelligence. It's just one measure to assess people's ability to understand quantitative data and facts. It's not, an ultimate IQ standard or anything. It's just, do you understand science? And he found a very weak positive correlation between ordinary science intelligence and whether people agreed that there's evidence that recent global warming is due to human activity, like burning fossil fuels. Then they took this data set and divided it in half based on one thing. You can probably guess what that is now. Politics. And this is what they found. They found that the smarter we were, the less likely we were to agree with this statement. There was an inverse correlation between intelligence and our willingness to agree with the statement that we believed conflicted with our political ideology. And so what they concluded is this, and let me translate this into English. Being smarter does not necessarily make us more accepting of science. It makes us better able to cherry pick the information we need to show that whatever we already believed, if we believed it, I use that word specifically because it means, it's something related to my identity. It's something that's really important to me that I have personal stake in. If we have a personal stake in something, the smarter we are, the better we are at cherry picking the information to show that we're right. And let me just say, we all do this. Every single one of us, we do this. Because if there's something really near and dear to our hearts, we don't want to change it. So when we run into somebody saying that's not true or that's not right, we go out and we find reasons to justify why we're right. And the smarter we are, the better we are at doing it. Let me give you a very low stakes example. And then maybe you can think of an example of how you do this in your own life too. So I grew up in a household where you eat all your food, and leftovers are actually often better than they were the first day. I mean, lasagna, it's always better the next day. My husband, and I grew up in Canada too. So, leaving the butter out on the counter is not a big deal. Refrigeration is not really a big concern. My husband grew up in the South. So for him, and very much for my mother-in-law, old food is bad food. And if it was left out for any amount of time, you don't eat it. And you can see how this kind of carries through as a cultural thread from 100 years ago when people didn't have refrigerators, right? Or more than 100 years ago, actually. So anyway, I personally think you need to eat everything that you have. And my husband's like, no, it's old, don't eat it. And so I'm like, oh, it's yogurt. It's just 2 days past its deadline. Of course we can eat it. And so what do? We go out and we find peer-reviewed journal articles saying why you can or can't eat food after the deadline. And I have to admit, I've certainly eaten a few things that I probably shouldn't have, and he's certainly thrown out some things that he probably should have eaten. But the point here is because it's part of our identity and our culture and our heritage, rather than changing what we thought, our first instinct was to just go find information to prove how we were right. And both being academics, of course, we went right to the peer-reviewed literature. So how do you do this? Maybe you don't do it with climate change, but maybe we do it with something else. That hopefully makes us a little more understanding of how and why people do it with this. But what's the third problem? So the first problem is it's not a case of more science. It's not a case of more intelligence. And here's the third problem. It's not a case of religious objections to climate change. And you might say, but Catherine, don't you understand that there's this whole group of people in the United States who will reject all of the science about everything. And they're called evangelicals. And my answer to that is yes. I do know about that group of people because it turns out that I am also an evangelical, but I'm a Canadian one. And I didn't realize there was such a big difference between Canadian ones and American ones until I moved to the States. I had never met somebody who didn't think that evolution was real until I moved to the US. But I'm reading a fascinating book right now. I'm only halfway through. I have to say it's very dense. It's written at the level of somebody who is actually in graduate school for history. So it refers to all these things that you're supposed to know about, but I don't know about, like the German School of Theology. I don't really know what German school refers to. So it's a bit frustrating in that respect. I don't think it's the best communicated book I've ever read, but it is very fascinating because I've learned all kinds of things, including something that totally blew my mind. The fact that theistic evolution, which is evolution, just evolution perceived as being designed by God rather than just occurring naturally or, on its own, but evolution was taught in conservative seminaries until after World War I. That totally blew my mind. And it turns out that opposition to evolution arose from political opposition to what was perceived as the German worldview of survival of the fittest in World War I. And the prosecutor at the Scopes trial was not only a Presbyterian minister, he was a former Secretary of State who was really worried about the German threat. So the whole mix of politics and theology and science is nothing new. It goes back all the way to the time of Galileo. I mean, all of the objections to Galileo's idea that the Earth orbits around the sun, they weren't really theological. It was all about challenging the Pope's authority in this material world. So I recognize that this is a gross simplification that I, as a scientist, am doing from a field that I'm not familiar with. But I'm just saying that it's really interesting to look at how politics and science and religion have always had this tension. And it really has very little to do with science. It's mostly politics and religion using science as sort of like a lightning rod for their tensions. So let's go on to talk about climate change. I am very aware that climate change is deliberately framed as a religion. Here's our senator from Texas telling us, it's not science, it's religion. You don't get any more blunt than that. And then Lindsey Graham, I know why, it's because Al Gore did it. And if you look at the internet, of course, you can find proof for everything. Here's the proof. And somebody has actually taken the time to Photoshop my head onto the choir. Now, here's the fascinating thing. It turns out that although the landscape of religion in the United States is changing very quickly, the vast majority of people in the US, 2/3 of us, still adhere to a specific religious tradition. So if you frame climate change as a religion, and believe me, it has been done deliberately. If you frame it as a religion, if you frame science as a religion, if you frame evolution as a religion, if you frame climate change as a religion, then the people who already have a religion, their instinctive reaction will be like, oh, well, I already have a religion. I don't want your new one. So framing this as a religion is a very intelligent and subtle way to get people to reject it. Just a little side note there. But of course, the reality is you can go to every single major religious tradition in the world. You can go to Muslim, you can go to Hindu, you can go to Buddhist, you can go to Jewish. You can obviously go to Catholics. The Pope published this encyclical 5 years ago, a whole book about climate change. Every single major world religion has at its core the idea of caring for or being good stewards of or having responsibility for this planet that we share with our sisters and brothers around the world. And the fascinating thing is, in the United States, the National Association of Evangelicals beat the Pope to it by 4 years. 4 years before the encyclical, they published a report called Loving the Least of These that specifically connects the dots between Christian values and caring about climate change. So we might say, and this is actually from our most popular Global Weirding episode, we have this YouTube series called Global Weirding, and much to my surprise, the episode everybody wants to watch is What Does the Bible Say About Climate Change? It's not a religious program, it's not a Christian program, it's PBS, but we answer people's questions like, how do we know it's not a natural cycle, and is a few degrees really such a big deal? And I did one on what does the Bible say about climate change, because that's, I get a lot of questions about that, and that's the most viewed episode. Anyways, so why don't we just get the Pope to set people straight? And it turns out that when we look at people's levels of concern over climate change, Hispanic Catholics are the most concerned. The most concerned people group in the United States are Hispanic Catholics. But then if we fill in the rest of the data, who's at the bottom? White Catholics and white evangelicals together. So my colleague Ashley here at Texas Tech, she studies public opinion and how it reacts to things like the Pope's encyclical. And what she found in a study that she conducted the year after the encyclical came out is going to be no surprise to you now. When people encounter new information, they interpret it through their filters of prior beliefs, relevant social identities, and messenger credibility. And you might say, well, who's more credible than the Pope to a Catholic? Unfortunately, in the United States, the answer is elite Qs. And elite Qs are thought leaders, not the Pope, thought leaders on their favorite news program, or politicians who they trust, or people who share their political ideology. So what Ashley found, translation again, is that if people, both Protestants and Catholics, already agreed with the Pope on climate change, after the encyclical came out, their opinion of the Pope went up. The Pope, not climate change. If they didn't agree with the Pope on climate change, after the encyclical came out, their opinion of the Pope went down. It turned out that the encyclical was a referendum, not on climate change, but on the Pope. And John Evans, another social scientist from UC San Diego, he said, it's true that conservative Christians in the US are less likely to agree with climate science, but, he said, when you control for other factors, it's not where they go to church, it's age, political conservatism, and the Republican Party. And Galen Carey from the National Association of Evangelicals, I think, said it best. He said, many people oppose action to slow climate change, but it's not on a religious basis. It's political because they believe the government wants to take away their freedom. What do we really have a problem with? If it isn't our intelligence, if it isn't lack of science, if it isn't our actual theology or lack thereof, what are our real problems? This is key. We're really getting to the meat of it here. Because if we address the perceived problems, it's like we're Don Quixote engaging with a windmill, or it's like we're Dorothy talking to the talking puppet in front of the screen, and there's somebody behind the curtain. So if we engage with what we perceive to be the problem, our communication and engagement is not going to be effective because we're not engaging with the real problem. Here is the real problem. There's actually three of them. 3 things that aren't the real problem and 3 things that are. The 3 things that are the real problem are this. Our identity is based on our politics. And if somebody doesn't share our identity, we don't want to hear from them. So identity politics is number 1. Number 2 is the issue of psychological distance. We don't think something matters to us. It matters to people over there, but it doesn't matter to us. And number 3, and this is key, this is responsible for 99.9% of the rejection of climate science, solution aversion. We don't think there's any way to fix the problem without employing solutions that are contrary to our values. And if we can't fix something, then we don't want to admit it's real, because if we say it's real but I don't want to fix it, that makes us a bad person. And we need to be a good person. So to justify ourselves, we make up reasons why it can't be real, rather than actually saying, I don't want to fix it. And we do this subconsciously, it's not really conscious. So let's look for a second at identity politics. Does a thermometer really give you a different answer depending on how you vote? Of course not. But in New Hampshire, this is work by Larry Hamilton, a social scientist in New Hampshire. In New Hampshire, they have had some very warm winters. In fact, the 90s and the 2000s, those winters were very, very warm, as you can see here. So he asked people, has it been warmer the last 20 years if you lived in New Hampshire? And he divided people's answers out by age, not a big difference. He divided their answers out by gender, not a big difference. He divided their answers out by education, again, not a big difference. And then he divided their answers out by what? Politics. turns out that how we identify ourselves politically affects not the number a thermometer gives us, but the number we think a thermometer gives us. What is psychological distance? Well, these maps from the Yale program on climate communication are so interesting because they break down people's answers to over 30 questions, I think, by county across the whole US. So you can play with these later if you're interested. I highly recommend them. And actually, Rebecca, if you don't mind, if you could just Google Yale Climate Opinion Maps 2019 and then put that link in the chat, and that way people could get the link to that if they're interested, because it's very interesting to look at these maps. I'm going to just take you through a few of them, though. So stay focused with me, and then you can get the link later. Do people think global warming is happening? Most people say yes. Orange means more than 50% of people saying yes, and darker orange, it means more people. Do they think it's going to harm plants and animals? Yes, the whole country's orange. Do they think it's going to harm future generations? Yeah, the whole country is again orange. But watch carefully. Here we go. Do you think it will harm people in developing countries? So not here, over there. Still mostly orange. Will it harm people in the United States? We're getting more blue in here. And then here's the kicker. Ready? Do you think it will harm you? Is this not shocking? Now you see a few orange counties, and now you know one reason for the orange counties, right? Who's the most concerned people group in the whole US about climate change? Hispanic Catholics, followed by Native Americans. That explains a lot of what we see here. But the vast majority of people, even people who would say, yes, I 100% agree with the science, they don't think it matters to them. And that is a much bigger problem. Because you can say, I completely agree with what all the scientists say, but if you don't think it matters, why would you ever want to do anything to fix it? But here's the interesting thing. Studies have shown, in fact, Chris Chu, who's a researcher again here at Texas Tech, he's shown that if you talk about climate impacts in a way that makes it relevant to people's lives, it actually decreases the political polarization. So if we talk about climate change impacts in Indonesia versus climate change impacts in the Midwest, people are less politically polarized over the information about the changes in the places where they live. Why do we have this issue of psychological distance? Often because the number one thing people think of when we say global warming is a polar bear. And most people haven't seen a polar bear in real life. Or if we think of people, it's people who live far away, not people who live where we live here. But of course, the reality is that climate change is already affecting us here and now. And this is the last and most important real problem people have, there are solutions. Now, I want to show you something fascinating. This is a senator from Oklahoma who so opposes the idea of climate change that he's actually took the time to write a book called The Greatest Hoax. He wrote a whole book about climate change and how it's a hoax. And he was famous for stunts like, bringing a snowball into the floor of the Senate and saying, look, it snowed in Washington, D.C., so where's global warming now? But here's something he said in 2012. He said, do you realize I was actually on your side of this issue when I was first chairing that Senate Environment Committee and I heard about it? I was on your side until when? I thought it must be true till I found out how much it would cost. Yes. And here is an absolutely classic clip. You have to say the people who write these subtitles absolutely have a sense of irony, because he's saying, I don't want to destroy the economy over climate change. And the subheader right below him says 1 million homes at risk due to climate change in Florida. So at this point, you might be thinking, well, how on earth are we supposed to talk about science in a fact-free world? And now that you actually understand the real problems, we can finally get to the solutions. What is the solution? The solution is to tackle the real problems and to do so in a way that bonds to address issues that divide us. So rather than dividing ourselves by starting a conversation with what we disagree on, begin a conversation with what we agree on, number one. Connect the dots to address the issue of psychological distance, connect the dots to what we care about, and don't forget to offer positive, constructive solutions to address the issue of solution aversion. So often we feel like any conversation about science has to start with science, right? And we all are tempted to do this. But if we just start with everybody knows that climate is changing and humans are responsible and the impacts are serious, that conversation tends to end by digging a trench rather than building a bridge. And worst case scenario, something like this. No, we have to begin the conversation, or I should say something like this too. We have to begin the conversation by bonding. So here's where I want you to start getting your thinking caps on. What types of things can we bond over? Well, you've got people, if you interact with people coming in the door of the Smithsonian, or you interact with people who are curious about science, you've already got people who are choosing to interact with you because of something that they think they share with you. In our personal lives, what we share with people can be very simple. It could be the place we live, our family, an activity we enjoy, the fact that we're a member of the Rotary Club or the Kiwanis Club or the Golf Club. That was the only icon PowerPoint had for clubs. Shared military experience. We can bond over knitting, over food, over being a parent or a grandparent. We can bond with people over shared love of birds or gems or astronomy. So get out your computer or your phone again. I'm going to give you one more practice question before we get to our questions at the end. We'll be those there in just a couple minutes. I want to ask you in one word, or if you have to have 2 words, have a dot there. In one word, what do you love? What do you care about that you could bond with people over? I love this. Food, nature, ocean, dogs, absolutely. Music, yes. Cats. We had to have cats in there too, to be fair. Parenting, outdoors. Oh, embroidery. I love that. I used to cross stitch like an absolute fiend, but it got a bit too much for my eyes, so I mostly knit now. Kids, birds, creativity, yes. Hiking, diving, travel. Oh, this is fantastic. While you're thinking, let me share a story with you about faith and diving. A couple months ago, when I was giving a talk out in California at a big public university there, a scientist came up to me afterwards and he said, I've been trying to reach out to our local faith community because I see how effective and how important that is, but I can't get my foot in the door. Could you give me any tips? And I said, sure. I said, the best thing to do is start with the faith community that you share the most with. So, what is your own, faith tradition, or where do you attend? And he said, oh, I don't go anywhere. I'm an atheist. So I said to him, well, then I think you should stop. I think you should stop because you don't have a common value to bond over immediately with people. I said, what do you enjoy doing? And he said, well, I'm a scientist. I said, yes, of course, we all are. But what do you enjoy doing? I said, do you enjoy birds, the outdoors, hiking? No. But then he said, well, I enjoy diving. In fact, I am a diver and I have some records for some deep dives. And he got very enthusiastic about how he loved diving. So I said, well, that's the perfect thing. How about you reach out to local PADI certification programs and offer your expertise to them to have conversations with people about how climate change is affecting the oceans and coral reefs and marine ecosystems and what they could do to make a difference. So whoever you are, whether you love beer or yoga or animals or God or LGBT rights or crafts, whoever you are the perfect person to care. I know a graduate student who loves online gaming. And so he started online gaming for climate change, where they talk about climate change as they game with people. This is perfect. I love this list. All right. So bond, number 1. Number 2, connect the dots to how what you care about already, what you both care about, relates to the issue you're talking about. In the case of climate change, often a sense of place or a sense of how it's affecting our food or our nature or our kids, how it's affecting our economy or our security, how it's affecting our families. The National Climate Assessment is fantastic, all 1,600 pages of it, in addressing how we are personally being affected. But then we have to talk about solutions too. We can talk about individual solutions like reducing food waste. We can talk about industrial solutions and what companies are doing, which is incredibly encouraging. It really gives us hope to find out what some of the biggest actors are doing. We can talk about what faith communities are doing. We can talk about what museums are doing. I love this example. The Cole Museum goes solar, but talking about what that museum is doing, what the Smithsonian is doing, is so encouraging. talking about what Washington, D.C. is doing. It has a fantastic climate action plan that I actually helped with. Talking about what airlines are doing. Yes, they're already running flights on biofuel. Talking about what's happening in unexpected places around the world, kids winning science fairs for developing algae biofuel in their bedrooms, clean energy revolutionizing some of the poorest parts in the world and helping us do better science there as well. The fact that we have more clean energy now being installed around the world on an annual basis than fossil fuels, and that's been happening for the last 5 years. Project Drawdown, if you're not familiar with it, they have all kinds of fantastic resources on really positive climate solutions. Everything from clean cook stoves and agriculture to educating women and girls in poor countries and reducing our food waste. I gave a talk at Christmas at a really big church in the Toronto area. And afterwards, I was listening to people leaving, and this one woman was talking to another, and she said, I always heard about climate change, but I never knew what to do. I didn't know what to do, but now I know what to do. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to eat the Christmas leftovers, and then we're going to join our stewardship group. And I was like, that's exactly it. Start small and then engage. Engage with people who share your values. Does having a conversation about climate change make a difference? It absolutely does. This study found that when we talk about climate change, we actually kick off a true positive feedback loop. The more we talk about it, the more we know. The more we know, the more concerned we are. The more concerned we are, the more we talk about it. And the incredibly encouraging thing is that when we talk about it to children, it actually changes their parents' minds. This study in North Carolina found that educating middle school children made their parents more concerned about climate change. And the effects were strongest when daughters talked to their conservative dads. Isn't that amazing? So, does it work on everybody? I'm going to say one little caveat here. It doesn't work on absolutely everyone because according to the Yale program on climate communication, we fall into 6 groups on climate change. 90% of us are, well, actually 2/3 of us are alarmed or concerned. And then the vast majority of us are either cautious or disengaged or doubtful. Only 10% are dismissive. Now, 10% include people we know, our Uncle Joe, our old college roommate, our brother-in-law, maybe even a colleague. A dismissive person, my personal definition, is somebody who, if an angel from God appeared before them with brand new tablets of stone saying global warming is real in foot-high letters of flame, they wouldn't change their mind. So why would we think we could change their mind? I don't think we can. But aside from the 90% of us, or aside from the 10% of us, 90% of us, we can engage. And what is the secret? The secret is, I've already told it to you, begin a conversation by bonding, connect to shared values, and talk about positive solutions. So how do we talk about climate change in that fact-free world? We connect with each other, starting with the heart rather than the head. We explain why this matters to us. And we always talk about things that we can do together, because working together overcomes what divides us. My TED Talk gives lots of examples of how to have these conversations. I haven't really explained that in detail here. I've talked about more, what do we want to address? But what I'm going to do is I'm going to leave you this as a resource. And now I'm going to take your questions. And here's how you do the questions. Remember, you enter your question. You can enter as many words as you want. You don't need to use a dot or a dash. But here's the fun thing. You can upvote the questions you want me to answer. I want to be respectful of people's time, so we just have 10 minutes left. But if you have a question, go ahead and enter your whole question here. And if you don't have a question, go here anyways and upvote the questions that you want me to answer first. That way we can make sure we get to the questions that most people want the answers to. So actually, Rebecca, while we're waiting, do you have a question, or did you see any questions that people had that you wanted us to talk about first? You'll have to unmute yourself there.
I'm just unmuting now. I've just posted a link to your TED Talk in the chat box as well, so people can readily access it. So I guess what you've made a very compelling case for putting facts through the side door, perhaps, where you're not leading with the way that we would traditionally communicate. You would lead with something that is shared, and then slide in once you've built that bridge, slide in other content. And what you're suggesting is that would actually work to some degree for about 90% of the people that we're talking to.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that so that's kind of the first part of my question. The second part would be, it must be very hard to receive a lot of the vitriol that you receive daily. And do you think that comes from the 10% that will never be convinced, or are they people that are somewhere else on that continuum?
Mm-hmm. Yes. So those are great questions. So yes, first of all, to emphasize the beginning, and you can keep adding your questions here and upvoting them as well. Positive conversations in general begin with bonding over a shared value. And again, a lot of you are fortunate in that people are coming to you because they perceive they have a shared interest. So really bonding can tackle and diffuse so much of the polarization that divides us. And you're already starting many steps ahead of many other people who are having these conversations. So I love where people put, when I asked you, what do you love? And people said curiosity, wonder, nature. Absolutely. Those are things that every child has. Most adult is conscious that they at least had it at some point and they hope to retain it. And when we go to museums and when we take our kids to museums, we're doing it because we want to foster that love of nature, that creativity, that wonderment, that awe, that amazement. And that is a fantastic place to begin the conversation. But that you don't want to end it there, because you want to help them grow. And the growth happens by starting with what you share and connecting it to the issue you're talking about, which can relate to everything to biodiversity loss, deforestation, habitat fragmentation, extinction, pollution, climate change, whatever it is that we're talking about, connecting the dots to show them, and this is key, to show them that who they already are is the perfect person to care. It isn't a case of changing who they are. It isn't a case of altering their values. It's a case of more genuinely expressing who they already are by caring about this issue. That is the key. If we're trying to change who somebody is, good luck if they're over the age of 10, maybe even 8. The values are often set pretty young. But if we show people that who they are already cares, they just haven't connected the dots, all of a sudden it's like a giant light bulb goes off. And in fact, I even have an essay, I'll put the link in the chat here. I have an essay I wrote for Foreign Policy a couple of years ago where I actually called it that. I said, everybody already cares about climate change, they just don't realize it. So that is so important, to recognize that we're not trying to change who people are, we're trying to respect who people are. We're not judging who people are, we're accepting who people are, but we're showing them how to be a more genuine version of who they already are. But yes, unfortunately, the majority of the attacks that I get online are from dismissives. And so that's why I don't think there's much point engaging with dismissives, because I don't think I'm going to change their mind. I engage very briefly. So if I were talking to a group of people and one dismissive pipes up, I would engage very briefly. I would say no, and then I would have one sentence explaining why they're wrong. So for example, if somebody says, oh, well, everybody knows one volcano produces more pollution than all humans all year, I would say no. All geologic activity produces the carbon emissions equivalent to just a few medium-sized US states. But then I would immediately pivot. Immediately. I would say, but did you know? And then I would give them a fact that was relevant to everybody else about why it matters to us or what we can do to fix it. So I wouldn't engage with them deliberately. I would just say, no, we have an answer to you, and let me talk to the other 90%. And this, I think, relates to any contentious issue. All right, we have a ton of good questions here. So why don't we take a quick look at those now? I will share my screen with you again, just a second here. And now you can see the questions here. This is a great tool I use called Poll Everywhere. It says, will the climate change debate be different after the coronavirus pandemic? I hope so, because first of all, things are happening in both directions. The bad news is our environmental protections are being rolled back. It's likely that the stimulus package in the US will be invested in continuing our investment in shoring up fossil fuels. Here in the US, things are unfortunately continuing to move backwards. In other places around the world, though, they are really seeing the pandemic as an opportunity for a Marshall Plan or a New Deal, where they invest in the future, in clean energy and sustainability and livable cities and much healthier ecosystems. And as individuals, though, I feel like what the pandemic has taught us is that no matter who we are, where we live, or what political party we're affiliated with, no matter what we see ourselves as, when it all comes down to it, what we have in common is much more than what divides us. We care about our health and our safety and our loved ones and our families and our communities. So I do hope the world will be different, and I hope that it will show us that what we have in common is much more than what divides us. How do we answer people who say climate's been changing over geologic time and it's been normal? I like to head those people off at the pass. When I'm talking about climate change, I like to be the first person to say it. I say, of course, we know that climate has been changing before. And we know that it's done so for natural causes, like the sun, volcanoes, natural cycles, and more. But did you know that today, according to natural factors, we should be cooling, not warming? We humans are now in the driver's seat. And we even have a global weirding episode. Let me just find that for you here, since you can see my screen. Global weirding series is on YouTube. If you just Google global weirding, it'll pop right up. If you go to YouTube and you look at global weirding, it will show you our most popular episodes. And number 4 is, this is all just a natural cycle, right? So please give that episode a watch. And let's see, I think I can put this in the, or maybe Rebecca, you could put that in the chat there, and you can give that a watch. How do we talk to people who think climate change effects won't be apparent until 30 years in the future? Well, we have a global weirding episode about that called, is just a few degrees a big deal? And what I do is I do it by bringing it home. I have a global weirding episode, for example, in every region of the US, and I talk about what is already happening, how our floods are already getting bigger and stronger, how hurricanes are more damaging, how wildfire is burning twice the area. I talk about something that has already happened to show people how we can connect the dots. We already know as well that climate change has increased the gap between the richest and poorest countries in the world by as much as 25%. We know that climate change has decreased our agricultural yields by about $5 billion a year since the 1980s. So talking about what has already happened is very powerful. I do a lot of that in my presentations. The National Climate Assessment does a lot of it, and our global weirding episodes do a lot of it too. Could I share any exhibits that do a really good job of conveying climate change? Oh my, well, that's a difficult question for me, because I was one of the advisors on the Anthropocene exhibit in the Fossil Hall in the Natural History Museum. So I tend to think that that does a fantastic job, because you've got people in there who are fascinated by dinosaurs and by geologic history, and then they're there and there's this display over climate change that talks not just about the future, but about now, and it talks not just about the impacts, but about the solutions. My favorite little movie clip there, and they have a lot of really good movie clips in the Anthropocene exhibit, is about a farmer who's doing carbon farming here in West Texas. And there is this brand new series of short movies that was just released on Earth Day last week called Carbon Cowboys. Rebecca, if you don't mind Googling it and putting a link in there, Carbon Cowboys, you got to just watch these little short movies. And people are like, I can identify with these people. And these people are not communists, they're not tree huggers, they're ultra conservative farmers with these big old accents talking about how they're being good stewards of the soil and they're helping to fix climate change. And so those type of communications that are clear and engaging, talk about solutions, and have unexpected messengers, I think are so powerful. And there's many of those out there. If you have to go, I totally understand, because we are at the hour, but I will give just a couple more minutes here because there's a couple good questions. So we'll just go a couple minutes over, and then this will be recorded, so you will be able to see this afterwards. How do we get people behind the big solutions when we can't tell them how to vote or encourage any political solutions? I'm in the same boat as an academic at a state-funded university as well. But what I do is I tell people to advocate for sensible solutions at every level. And advocating is not necessarily telling people to vote. It's just saying we need solutions no matter who we are. Doesn't it just make sense? We all want a healthy economy, of course. We want clean air to breathe, of course. We want clean water to drink. We want food for our families. We want a safe place to live. We all want the same things. Doesn't it make sense to talk about why these matter? Now, some people will say that's political, but talking about the fact that something is real, it matters to us, and there are solutions that are bipartisan, like the Climate Solutions Caucus, but there are solutions that are just practical, like Project Drawdown. That is not political. And again, some people will say any mention of climate change is political, but talking about how it matters to us and what are some sensible things we can do to fix it is not. And then most people are smart enough to connect the dots, I think. Most people are smart enough to say, hey, I've been thinking about this and talking about this and learning about this, and my politician isn't saying these things. So why aren't they saying these things? Most people will connect the dots. And then, is there a way to address the role that racism may play in climate change dismissal? Oh my gosh. Climate change is a profoundly unjust issue. It disproportionately affects the poorest and most vulnerable people. Air pollution from fossil fuels kills 200,000 people in the US every year. A much greater proportion of them are African American because of the correlation between not being able to live in places that have clean air or access to adequate health care and lower socioeconomic status. And we're seeing that the same people are being affected by the coronavirus, because if our lungs are weak, we're much more vulnerable. So in Chicago, for example, 30% of the population is African American. 60% of the serious COVID-19 cases and the deaths are African American. So issues of justice, racism, gender equality are all connected. My colleague, Catherine Wilkinson, has a fantastic TED Talk, and I'll show it to you right here. Let's see, called how empowering women and girls can help to fix climate change. It is all part of the same issue. And if we care about people, if we care about justice, if we care about equality and fairness, then we already care about climate change. It's the same thing. All right. Last question, and these are connected. How do we talk to thought leaders, and what's the role of social media? It's really hard to bond with people on social media. It's very hard. And so I see social media more as providing information for people who already want it rather than reaching people who don't. There's a few exceptions. I get a lot of people lurking on my Facebook page who send me a message maybe 2 years later saying that, finally that they're actually convinced after they lurked for about 2 years. But social media is difficult. That personal connection is so powerful. On social media, we can reach the 2/3 of people who are already concerned and share information with them that they can share with other people. How do I reach thought leaders, though? I really think it is solution aversion, number one. So providing them with solutions that they can get on board with that they don't see as compromising their values. And number two, providing them with protective cover. Similar leaders who agree. Similar politicians, similar industry leaders, similar companies, similar military leaders, really building coalitions to support people so they don't feel like they're going out like the Lone Ranger, like Bob Inglis. If you don't know who Bob Inglis is, you want to give him a Google because he's a very interesting person, a super conservative Republican congressman who was convinced of the reality of climate change. If you Google Bob Inglis, you'll get some really interesting stories about him. But it really is important to help build that protective cover. And so Citizens Climate Lobby is one of the organizations that I serve as a scientific advisor to, because they are a bipartisan organization who tries to build that cover by having a bipartisan climate solutions caucus where you can only join if you join with somebody from the other party. So it's 50-50 Democrat and Republican. So I think that's very powerful. But even just talking to constituents and then constituents who can engage can be very effective. So thank you so much for having me. This has been absolutely wonderful. Your questions are fantastic. Any last words, Rebecca?
Well, I would like to, on behalf of the museum community, thank you for a brilliant talk, Catherine. I know we can't clap, but we can all say thank you so much like this. It's such a thought-provoking presentation. I think we can all go away and think about how we can work hard to communicate with the 90%. We can think about our own passions and see how we can use them as the doorway towards making conversations with people who will be receptive to hear what we have to say. So it's been a privilege to hear from you today, and thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much for having me. Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.